to welcome you at the continuation of our public program of the Kyiv in 2019. And today's event is titled, Is There Really a Crisis of Democracy? And first of all, I would like to express our deep thankfulness to our tonight's speaker, Professor Jan-Werner Müller. Thanks so much for kindly accepting our invitation and to manage to come here for the first time to Ukraine. But basically, within this lecture, we are somehow following the line which we tried to draw also during previous weeks and within the recent events of the public program, which more or less in particular deals with the crisis of contemporary representative democracy model under the pressure from both neoliberal and so-called illiberal forces. And tonight's talk is basically dedicated to the institutional crisis of intermediary powers, in particular political parties and the media, and what kind of institutional reform is needed in that regard. And with pleasure, I will introduce our tonight's speaker, Jan-Werner Müller, who teaches in the political department at Princeton University. He also has been a member and a visiting fellow in a variety of educational institutions all over the world, in particular Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, Collegium Helsinki, the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, the Remarque Institute in New York University, and so on. Müller is also a co-founder of the European College of Liberal Arts in Berlin, and he is the author of a great number of books. I will just name some of them. Another Country, German Intellectuals, Unification and Nation Identity of 2000, A Dangerous Mind, Carl Schmitt in Post-War European Thought of 2003. And he was also an editor of Memory and Power in Post-War Europe, Studies in the Presence of the Past of 2002, and German Ideology since 1945, Studies in the Political Thought and Culture of the Bonn Republic. His most probably popular book, What is Populism?, was published in 2017 and has been translated almost like a Bible into 25 languages. And his forthcoming books are Democracy Rules and Street, Palace, Square, What Spaces for Democracy. Thanks so much for coming again. After the lecture, we will have Q&A with the public, so I encourage you to raise your hands and to ask questions afterwards. Thank you.
Almost every week, a new book comes out with titles such as Death of Democracy, Collapse of Democracy, End of Democracy, Erosion of Democracy, and so on and so forth. I'm not in any way suggesting that these books aren't justified. As many social scientists, many contemporary historians, many observers have pointed out, there is something going on. Some of us have given us hard data, have given us numbers to convince us that the number of democracies overall in the world has been declining for quite some time. They've also tried to show to us that the quality of democracy, never mind the overall quantity of democracies, has been going down in a number of countries. So I'm not denying there's a problem here. I do, however, have a problem with some of the language that is sometimes employed to address this problem. And I do have a problem with some of the alleged causes and factors that are said to have contributed to the problems we face in politics today. Because of that, I wanted to start off with some remarks on what I take to be popular, but ultimately misguided and unhelpful ways of talking about crisis of democracy today. In a second step, I'll go back to the Bible, no, not the Bible, but my book, and I'll talk a little bit about populism, because I think the problem that we actually are facing in our democracies today can be summed up with that term, as long as it is understood in a fairly precise way, and doesn't become a sort of blanket term for all criticism of the powerful, of elites, of the establishment, and so on. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about what I take to be at least a contributing factor when it comes to problems of democracy in general and the rise of populism in particular. I don't mean to suggest that what I will try to describe as a particular set of problems with those institutions which were basically taken to be necessary for the proper functioning of representative democracy ever since the 19th century, namely political parties and professional media. I'm not saying that the problems that these institutions today face explain everything. Sometimes when one reads about what's happening in the world today, one feels that people are just so hungry for, the one big cause that explains everything in terms of the alleged global wave of populism. Which is a little ironic, if I may add a footnote, in light of the fact that, of course, very often it's also said that populists are those who always horrendously simplify everything. The world is complex, but these populists give us simple answers. But let's be honest, I think most of us would also love it, if somebody could explain everything to us in, let's say, 140 characters, or maybe 240 characters, but something along those lines. I don't want to go down that road. I don't want to suggest that the institutions that I will focus on in the last chapter of the talk, so basically professional media and political parties, that their problems explain everything. But given how much attention has been paid to economic factors, to broadly speaking cultural factors, I think it's important to shift the perspective to some of these institutional questions, which in my view have overall received too little attention in the whole debate. Anyway, that's where I'll end up. I'll start somewhere else. I'll start on a, if you permit, more negative note, and just make a couple of very brief remarks about what I see as somewhat misguided diagnoses in terms of what we are faced with in politics today. Two in particular, I think, have become very prominent and, alas, I think very misleading. First, especially among those who in the broadest term, in the broadest sense, you might describe as liberals, it's become pretty fashionable to put it bluntly, to blame the people themselves. Essentially to draw on what pretty much often looks like, direct imports from 19th century mass psychology. Claims along the lines of, the masses are so irrational, they're so ready to be seduced by the great demagogue who makes all these false promises. All that kind of talk has come back with a vengeance in the last couple of years. And sometimes very openly, these liberals will say, we see the political catastrophes of our age, Brexit, Trump, and you know what? We think that the people themselves brought them onto themselves. And very often, not always quite so openly, more often with a hushed voice, the recommendation then is to basically, to put it bluntly, become somewhat more, dare I say, elitist again. More gatekeepers, more people who control access to politics, more decision-making power taken away from the people, because if you give them too much, you have catastrophic outcomes. That's become very pervasive as a diagnosis. If nothing else, it's empirically highly dubious. It's simply not true that before 2016, the masses in the United Kingdom were all clamoring for a referendum on whether or not to stay inside the European Union. Plenty of studies have shown us that this was maybe barely in the top 10 of issues that people actually cared about. As you all know, the situation today is very different. But one can't infer from that this was somehow something that the people themselves really wanted as an outcome. Rather, the much more plausible and really not very original explanation of what happened is that it was actually a political party that was at the beginning of this process, namely the Conservative Party, which essentially couldn't arrive at a collectively binding decision about its relationship to the European Union. And then almost in a sort of act of desperation, and also, if I may put it that way, in an act of great political opportunism, sort of threw it to the people and said, okay, now if you decided, then finally maybe our backbenchers will shut up and we'll have peace inside our party. Well, we all know that that's not quite what happened as a result, but it's important to remember that that was the idea. In the United States, it's worth remembering that in a certain way, again, at the beginning of this entire fateful story, that of course is still unfolding, now with a very prominent place for your country in the narrative, that in this whole story, it was also a political party that at the very beginning, in a certain way, abdicated responsibility. It was the Republican Party that in a certain way said, okay, we're going to outsource candidate selection for the presidency to basically cable TV. We're going to allow them to make a show out of this according to their own imperatives, which are very different imperatives from a political party. And I think it's not too much of a stretch to argue that had the beginning not been basically run according to the parameters of show business, I mean, I realize that this might sound eerily familiar to some of you around here for other reasons. Had it not been run according to those imperatives, I think it's a fairly safe bet that the outcome also would have been somewhat different. So, long story short, all I'm trying to make plausible to you is that it's not the people themselves who are at the origin of the troubles of our times. It is actually much more plausible to argue that elite failure is the beginning of the story. Second, somewhat, maybe not quite so prominent explanation today, sort of goes to the other extreme, and essentially wants to argue that we are back in an age that is somewhat comparable to the 20th century, and more particularly it's somewhat comparable to what historians sometimes call the age of ideologies. A sense that we have, sort of big thought systems confronting each other. That it's not true that liberal democracy is the only game in town when it comes to legitimacy, but that instead we have a real competition of different systems and ideas again. Concretely, what that has meant sometimes is that somebody sort of hears something about who might be the great philosopher behind the throne. So somebody all of a sudden says, who's really behind the Russian president? Well, maybe Alexander Dugin. Maybe he is the great thinker, such that if we only understand what he's about, we finally understand the game plan of what Russia is really trying to do. Or, an example closer to home, Stephen Bannon. Remember Stephen Bannon? Stephen Bannon at one point sort of dropped a hint when he alluded to the interwar traditionalist, some would say fascist, Italian thinker, Julius Evola. We, in a sense, are blessed to live in an age where we have many, many excellent and unfortunately for the most part underemployed intellectual historians, such that somebody, usually within half a day, can write up a fantastic 3,000-word essay on Evola, which then comes out in the Atlantic or somewhere else, which explains everything about this thinker. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't look at these thinkers, but I think in many ways it's a misleading path. I don't believe that we are actually truly back in a situation of comprehensive ideologies confronting each other. The really strange thing about our time is that at least officially, everybody still wants to talk democracy talk. There are exceptions, which are easy to think of, but strangely, the tendency remains to basically convince as many audiences as possible that you are a proper democracy. And if that weren't true, then surely countries like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and the usual suspects wouldn't have to buy themselves Western politicians to make the case in all kinds of international institutions that these are truly proper democracies. So I think we're in a somewhat paradoxical situation that yes, something is happening with democracy. There is something going on that is very worrying, but it's not really accompanied by an official rejection or disavowal of democracy, such that one could really say, and this is now the rival system, this is the clear systemic alternative that people really want to go for. So what then instead? Well, I'll try to open the second chapter of the talk tonight. My suggestion, my, if you like, conceptual, theoretical suggestion to you is to look at populism, but understood in a very precise manner. And not only that, but also populism understood not just as a form of rhetoric, as some observers sometimes put it, but also as a set of practices. As you might even say, a certain kind of art of governance, which has particular elements and which, alas, I think we are seeing in an increasing number of countries around the world. Okay, what do I mean? Well, the conventional wisdom of our time is, of course, to say things like, well, populism is about criticizing the establishment, being angry with elites, this sort of rhetoric, which on one level seems completely commonsensical. At the same time, when you think about it, it's actually a very strange notion. Up until just a few years ago, I think any old civics textbook, any old good social teacher in school would have said to you that being critical with the powerful is actually a sign of good democratic, is this something I said? A good democratic citizenship. And being critical with the powerful is not automatically somehow dangerous for democracy. Quite possibly the contrary is the case. And yet, come the early 21st century, we read and hear day and night that, to be a populist is somehow maybe very dangerous. The second element, I think, is less obvious. The second element consists of the fact that these populist politicians are then also going to say that all those among the people themselves, all those citizens who do not share their particular understanding of the allegedly real people, that with all those citizens, you can basically put into doubt whether they truly belong to the people at all. Let me try to illustrate this perhaps less self-evident point with two quotations. At the very end of the very long night of the Brexit vote, Nigel Farage gave a speech where he famously said this had been, as he put it, a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% of British people who wanted to stay inside the EU, well, on some level, aren't quite real. Do not truly belong to the British, or maybe in the case of Farage, even specifically the English people. Or, if you permit me, a quotation from our president. In May 2016, Trump gave a campaign speech which, given all the very interesting things he was saying on other occasions, got virtually no attention. And yet it contained a phrase that in many ways was deeply revealing. Trump on that occasion said, I'm quoting from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people. And all the other people don't need anything. I hope you can see where this is going. The important point about populism is not really criticism of elites. All of us can criticize the powerful. Doesn't mean we're right, but it certainly isn't in and of itself dangerous for democracy. Quite possibly the opposite. The really important and worrying and damaging element of populism is what you might call anti-pluralism. It's the tendency always to exclude. Obviously at the level of party politics. Everybody else is corrupt and crooked. Less obviously at the level of the people themselves, where you say, in effect, that some people, usually but not only vulnerable minorities, don't truly belong to the people in the first place. So it's this double exclusionary move that matters. And yes, it's also true at the same time, as in a sense was evident just in this quotation from Trump. It's at the same time true that many populist leaders constantly talk about unification. I mean, the Orbans, the Erdogans of this world, they constantly talk about unifying the people. But it's always unification on their terms. And if you don't want to be unified on their terms, you are simply out. That, in a nutshell, is what I'm trying to make plausible to you about, hopefully, a more precise understanding of populism. If I'm permitted to add one footnote it may have occurred to you, if you find this at all plausible as an approach, that any populist who loses an election or who doesn't get an overwhelming majority, 73% or something like that, that any populist like that sort of has a massive problem. Because how can it be that on the one hand, we and only we, I and only I represent the real people, and on the other hand, we don't win the election? Can't be. It's logically impossible. Very often, I'm not saying always, but very often, populists who lose deal with this problem in a very particular way. What they tend to do is to suggest that one should take another look at this notion of the silent majority. By their own definition, by their own logic, could the majority express itself, they would always already be in power. The fact that they're not in power suggests that maybe we're not dealing with a silent majority, but with a silenced majority. In other words, the suggestion comes in that the elections must have been manipulated, that something must have gone wrong. Otherwise, of course, the true representatives of the people would have won. Again, I'm not claiming that this always happens, or that this is a predictable regularity. But I also think it's not an accident that so many populists on the losing side immediately contest the legitimacy of the election. Most recent example, you will remember, was the mayoral election in Istanbul. The claim was immediately that it can't possibly be true that the governing party has lost. Obviously, as you will remember, Erdogan eventually conceded. It's maybe worth adding about this fact that this has now often been celebrated along the lines of, look, even in Turkey, which is so damaged as a democracy at this point, even there you can still win elections. That's a very hopeful sign. Some of you may remember that then many activists started to talk about the Istanbul Express. For instance, in Hungary, people said, and the Budapest Express is going to be next, because we're going to win our mayoral election as well, which they did, by the way. What's maybe worth adding to that very hopeful, uplifting, positive-sounding story, which wasn't widely reported, I think, is that, yes, İmamoğlu is now the mayor of Istanbul, but of course what the government in Ankara proceeded to do was to take as many powers as possible away from him, and especially to make it much more difficult for him to allocate resources. So under such conditions, it becomes an interesting question, what it really means to win and to truly be in power, when as soon as you win, your power is systematically eroded or cut down. Anyway, allow me to, still within this chapter about populism, allow me to say a couple of words about this other phenomenon that I alluded to at the beginning, what I try to sometimes call a populist art of governance. In other words, the fact that we see a particular pattern of what these actors tend to do once they get into government. And I think this is worth saying, because there remains still, again, especially among observers who in the broader sense might be called liberal, a sort of tendency to say, well, these populists, they probably, are all demagogues, and they probably have horrendously simplistic ideas about policy, and yeah, let them come to power. Let them come to power, and then we're all going to see how they're going to fail. Because, none of the promises are going to be kept, no walls are going to get built, no trade agreements are going to get renegotiated. It's going to be blindingly obvious to all their followers that nothing really works. Or if they actually learn in government and they become pragmatic and they moderate, then that's also good, because then in a sense they cease to be populists. Or, so a variation of this thought, also very prominent, if populism is really just about anti-elitism, then it's often said, look, as soon as these actors are in power, they have become the elite. So by definition, they can't be populists anymore. I hope you can see where all these sort of reasonings are going. Basically, the problem is always going to solve itself. Either they stay populist, in which case they get unpopular, or if they moderate and become pragmatic and so on, then actually, they also cease being populist in a certain way, and the problem also solves itself. Very comforting story, and alas, I think very wrong. We have seen so many governments in our era. Just think of some of the names that I've already mentioned tonight. Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Venezuela. This is not just a matter of being on the right. Possibly India, if you look at some of what Modi is doing today. Plenty of examples, in short, that demonstrate to us that not only can populists govern, they can govern specifically as populists, by which I mean as actors who on one level do not accept the legitimacy of an opposition, and who then also very typically, just to remind us of the obvious, will react to criticism from independent institutions, be it courts or be it free professional media, with claims along the lines of, who elected you? We are elected, and by the way, we're also the only authentic representatives of the people. All criticism, all opposition in a certain way is simply illegitimate. A lot of that isn't new. Napoleon III, in 19th century France, he also already talked this way. When he was criticized by journalists, he also always responded by asking, who elected you? I'm elected, I won a massive plebiscite. So that's not new. But maybe some other stuff is new. And if I may, I'll just lay out for you 3 elements of what I take to be this populist art of governance, and maybe we can have an interesting discussion about some of them later on if you like. First, I think what these regimes have shown to us is that populists will very typically try to, let's say, occupy the state itself. They will try to replace what, at least in theory, should be a neutral bureaucracy/civil service with partisan actors. Now, many of you are probably thinking, okay, and pretty much almost any party, if you look around the world, kind of tries to do that to some extent. This cannot be particularly populist. True, but the difference, I believe, is that these populist actors do this much more massively and, in a sense, very openly. Because remember their initial claim. Their claim is, we and only we represent the people. Who is the state supposed to serve? Well, the people, of course. So if the party takes possession of the state, this is not something illegitimate, let alone corrupt. This is actually, in a certain way, how things should be, which is why they do it sometimes so openly and so brazenly. Secondly, and along somewhat similar lines, a lot of these regimes also engage in what political scientists would usually call mass clientelism, which is just a long-winded, highfalutin way of saying that supporters of the regime get benefits or, let's say, bureaucratic favors. Again, you're going to say to me, but look, I mean, so many parties in government try to do that, and it's also not even necessarily so illegitimate that you reward the people who voted you into office. Again, absolutely true, with one important difference. Populists, remember, start out with the idea that actually not all citizens are the real people. Only some people are the real people. So the fact that only the real people get benefits, get, let's say, whatever a welfare state might produce, is not something to hide or be ashamed of or see as vaguely illegitimate. That's exactly how things should be. And if there is anything to this thought, it just might be a possible explanation of something that otherwise I think is really very, very puzzling. I'm talking about the fact that there are also many examples of populists who campaign, who crusade with, the usual anti-corruption slogans. And then they come to power. And guess what? They turn out to be 10 times as corrupt as the people whom they have replaced. And as a kind of innocent observer, one would think, okay, this must be fatal. I mean, if this is your main promise, and then, there are tape recordings, or there are files, or whatever it is that, conclusively prove that you are even more corrupt than, the party that was, let's say, in Turkey in power before, etc., then, why isn't this an absolute knockout? Well, one possible answer might be that what outside observers see as corruption isn't seen as corruption by some of the people on the inside. That this is just them doing what is right for us, the real people, and the fact that they also get a little bit on the side is okay, or is just about acceptable. Whether that's really the explanation or not, I can't prove to you conclusively, but I do want to suggest to you that there is a puzzle here that merits our attention, and that, you know, if it's on this explanation, then it has to be something else. Maybe it's, you know, huge restriction of media pluralism, so that, you know, what outside observers see as corruption and can prove as corruption simply isn't perceived on the inside because nobody dares to write about it or report on it on radio and television. Maybe. But in many cases, people do kind of know, and it's not as if, you know, there's such a complete censorship of these sorts of views. Anyway, allow me to complete this picture with what I see as yet another important element of this populist art of governance. And this will not surprise you in the least. I'm talking about the pattern that as soon as there's protest against a populist government or regime from civil society, as soon as people start to march out there, the response by these governments / regimes is virtually always the same. And arguably it's a strategy that was pioneered by somebody who governs a little bit further east from here. I'm talking about the typical reaction where governments say, look, you might naively think that these are citizens out there protesting against their government. But of course that's not the case. Everything, according to these governments defending themselves, has of course been manipulated, has been paid for by some shadowy force behind the scenes. That's, well, not really even out there because you can't really see it. And as you all know, then the usual suspects are trotted out. So it may have been the CIA, George Soros, always a favorite in these discussions, but no limits to creativity. You don't have to stick, you know, with the people that come to mind immediately. Just as an example for remarkable creativity, if you think back to the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul in 2013, remember how at least some of the members of the government came out and said, this isn't genuine civil society protest by people who want to save this park. This, of course, has all been organized, I mean, it's totally obvious once you think about it, this has all been organized by Lufthansa, the German airline. Why? Because Istanbul now has this fantastic new airport, Turkish Airlines is the best airline in the world, they're really very worried, the Germans that is, that Turkish Airlines is going to become more important than Frankfurt Airport and Lufthansa and so on. That's why they called all these protesters to the German embassy, gave them instructions, and then sent them out there to do what they do. On one level, you might say, again, a sort of banal technique of how you preserve power in the face of certain developments. But beyond that, I think, again, there's an important link to the initial underlying claim that populists make. If you really believe that you and only you represent the people, then by definition, it cannot be true that there are real people out there who criticize, go against, disavow their only authentic, their only truly legitimate representatives. So there is a logic as to why you have to prove that these are not truly citizens protesting out there. And just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with governments pushing back against protests in and of itself. I mean, a normal democratic government would be perfectly entitled to say, we are elected, we take note of the protests, of course we listen to the arguments, but if you expect real change, wait for the next election. And you know, that's how it's going to be like. But that is fundamentally different from somebody who says, or in this case, tweets, that these are all, quote-unquote, paid-up activists, as Trump did, for instance, in the face of millions of people protesting his so-called Muslim travel ban. That's a different approach. That basically doesn't allow anybody to get into a political discussion because it cuts away the legitimacy of the actors right away. I mean, why would you talk to somebody who you basically consider to be fake, a fake citizen who actually, you know, was not going to speak in good conscience and in good faith and put forward arguments that you might take seriously. Anyway, that completes what I take to be a very rough, but hopefully not completely implausible picture of what this art of populist governance today looks like. I am not saying that having this kind of art makes these actors invincible. Not at all. But my impression is that if anything, the tendency today remains to underestimate them. And we underestimate them because we still believe in these liberal fairy tales that, oh, it's going to solve itself somehow, they will moderate, you know, it's going to disappear, etc., etc. And I think that's been conclusively disproven. What we might also underestimate to some degree is the ability of these actors to learn from each other. I don't believe that anybody truly thought after 1989 that history has ended. I think this is just a stupid historiographical cliche. But I think something else people actually did believe. Namely, that democracies always screw up. But that democracy is the only truly learning system. That only democracies have actors who can admit mistakes, correct mistakes, and so on. And that basically, the authoritarians, to put it bluntly, are always done. And they're all going to end like the Soviet Union, because they can't learn from mistakes, and they can't admit mistakes, and so on. And I think that, A, was an illusion, and B, has been disproven very conclusively. I can't quite prove this to you empirically, but I don't think it's a matter of conspiracy to, for instance, point to the, at the time, much publicized meeting between Orban and the then newly elected, well, he wasn't of course elected because he isn't anything officially, but Kaczynski. So it was, in a sense, very obvious that Kaczynski was now going to learn how you fool the EU while you dismantle your constitutional court, how you kind of keep them at bay, how you give them confusing language, what kind of strategies you can employ if you want to basically get away with doing something that, under normal circumstances, everybody would have understood is deeply autocratic. So there is a kind of governmental knowledge, if you like, that's out there and that can be shared. And I think if we don't see that, we are underestimating these actors, and we do so at our own risk. Okay, very last chapter of my remarks here tonight. Somewhat different tack. This is not directly about populism anymore as a particular danger. It's also, as I was trying to say at the beginning, and I hope this is not hugely disappointing, this is also now not the kind of, and here is the cause of everything in 140 characters bit of the talk. But it is trying to identify a problem that, broadly speaking, I think hasn't received enough attention. And that problem has to do with, as I was trying to make plausible at the beginning, the institutions, the, if you like, intermediary institutions, mediating institutions between citizens and democratic governments, which ever since the 19th century were taken to be crucial for the functioning of representative democracy. So political parties and a professional press, and then later on professional media more broadly. This, as you all know, was not foreordained, was not predetermined as an outcome. The American founding fathers, for instance, of course, were still completely against the idea of political parties. They thought that if political parties come on the scene, that's the end of a proper republic. That's absolutely undesirable. Parties are always the same as factions. And throughout the history of political thought, one of the great boogeymen of pretty much everybody was always, oh, factions, that's basically just one step away from a civil war. And yet, in the 19th century, something like regulated rivalry of parties emerges, a system where these contending parties, while being in a conflict, at the same time can recognize each other's legitimacy. So the very thing that, of course, populists on one level deny. And what the media do for us, I will not bore you with. This is all so clear, so obvious that we don't need to rehearse it. What, of course, we do know at this point is that both party systems, but especially the professional media, are undergoing structural transformations that are of such a magnitude and of such a as yet unclear character that particular development should give us all pause in terms of what this might possibly mean long-term for the fate of democracy. Well, if we try to think about this, I think one important first step beyond all the immediate worries about, oh, yesterday Facebook did this and tomorrow Google is going to do that. All that's important. But to kind of really make sense of what's happening, I think we need a framework. We need a framework that allows us, in a first step, to understand more clearly what the relationship between these mediating institutions and democracy actually is. What are their precise functions? What is their, if you like, normative function that is so important? And only once we've done that work, I think, can we come to a more sober assessment of what exactly is going on. And I stress that point because if you go back a little bit in time to debates, for instance, in the 1920s, you could take a lot of the books that were published in those days and drop them into our discussions today, and they read exactly like we talk today in terms of democracy is lost because of this is happening with the press, professional journalism is going down the drain, and so on and so forth. That's not to say that, therefore nothing bad is happening. It's just to say that it's very easy to lose perspective. It's very easy to lose one's bearings because we don't really have, I think, good theoretical accounts of the specific role of intermediary institutions for our democracy. So allow me, by way of wrapping up the talk tonight, to suggest a number of these, if you like, normative functions that intermediary institutions, broadly speaking, have. And if you find this perhaps a plausible framework, then the next step would be to use that and think through the particular challenges we are facing today because of the usual suspects, rise of social media, end of local journalism in many countries, and so on and so forth, plus, on the other side, the profound transformation of a whole range of party systems. So, what do these intermediary institutions really do for us? Well, and this goes back to something I spent quite a bit of time talking about, well, one thing they do for us is, in a sense, to reinforce a particular kind of pluralism. Of course, not infinite pluralism. I mean, parties are partisan. That's the whole point. But, as many commentators I think have rightly pointed out, being a member of a party does not mean that you assume that the underlying political principles to which you are committed as a partisan somehow magically execute themselves, as if there could be no disagreement, as if there couldn't be meaningful debate about what these underlying principles might mean. So in a well-functioning party, you might say, well, something like intra-party democracy is not just some sort of big PR show to convince people that they also have a say. It is actually a very important part of the process of coming to some understanding of what these principles really mean, how they could be translated into action once one gets into government, and as a side effect, that's not the point of the exercise, but as a side effect, citizens become habituated to a certain kind of, let's say, respectful disagreement. And the kind of populist imaginary, the kind of populist line that, there's only one real people, there's only one voice of the people, there's only one way forward, that to some degree would be weakened. Because even as you are with people who you broadly speaking agree with, who you're on the same side with on a partisan spectrum, nevertheless, disagreement, pluralism, if you like, becomes legitimate. And if you think there is anything to this thought, then maybe one of the peculiarities of our age is again a particular kind of paradox. Namely the fact that, of course, many countries are highly polarized. I mean, this is, no newspaper commentary nowadays can do without the cliche of saying, oh, our democracies are so divided and so much polarization and so on. But the paradox is this: hyper-partisanship on the one hand, hyper-polarization, and at the same time, weak or hollowed out parties. You would have thought that polarization and partisanship go along with strong parties, robust parties that actually have these internal processes, that actually produce policies, that kind of look like strong institutions. But in fact, in so many countries, they are weak institutions. And perhaps the causality isn't quite what one might think it is initially. And it actually goes from weak parties to something like increasingly prevalent populism, or at least polarization. So that's one thought for your consideration. The second one is that something else that these intermediary institutions do, if they work well, is to structure political time, which I know sounds very abstract, but is meant to get at the intuition that there's something very important about the fact that we do democracy with a particular rhythm and with a particular way of foreseeing events, of basically being able to understand the underlying structure of what becomes important when you have to orient yourself around certain discussions, when you can maybe kind of gain some more distance again. It's something that we kind of take for granted. But if it disappears, it usually has very significant consequences. This is not something that necessarily has disappeared in the case of party politics. But of course, in certain ways, it has disappeared in the case of the media. Because this sort of sense of here is a clear structure of how the media operates and how it divides up time has more or less gone by the wayside in the front of a 24-hour news cycle where everything always hits you at the same time. Some of you may remember that famous remark by Hegel where he said, for the modern bourgeois, reading the newspaper in the morning, that's basically a form of prayer in the modern world. But of course nobody does this anymore. Nobody prays anymore, so to speak. We just, do something else all the time, and there's no sort of obvious ritualistic element to this anymore, and there's no obvious kind of structural element to this anymore. And again, I would submit for your consideration the thought that this structuration of time also played a very important role when it came to functioning intermediary institutions. I certainly don't want to idealize this. The other line that maybe came to mind for some of you was Oscar Wilde's famous remark when he said, well, socialism is a great idea, but it takes too many evenings. Because who wants to go to all these party meetings? Who wants to, constantly have to, adapt to pre-structured time when you have to go to all these things where, various theorists and fanatics and, God forbid, professors, go on and on and on about something. Sure, that's there too. But if we only look at that cliche and we don't see the other and more positive side of that process, I think we lose something important. Last point, as somebody told me the other day, you always must say in conclusion because the audience must have hope at some point. So in conclusion, but not quite yet actually, not quite in conclusion yet, but as a last point about this role of intermediary institutions, I think it's also an important function that such institutions are both accessible and accessible. This is a pair of terms that I borrow from the distinguished British philosopher Honora O'Neill, who put it forward in the context of thinking about the British media. And she said, look, it's very important that media are accessible. Well, you might say that isn't really our problem nowadays. But it's also very important that they are accessible. In other words, that you can sort of categorize them. You can come to some judgment about, of course, how reliable they are, where they come from, what they are about, and so on. And I think as we've seen very clearly, again in the case of some of the regimes I mentioned earlier on, but even beyond that, that sort of function of accessibility has either been destroyed purposefully or has become much more difficult. Because we are constantly hit by things that are very hard to categorize, very hard to make sense of. Again, it would be a mistake to idealize the Hegel prayer thing and say, yes, it was great when there was one national newspaper that everybody read at exactly the same time and everybody believed exactly what it said in that paper. Again, I'm not idealizing that particular past. I'm just trying to make us more sensitive to what might be lost in a situation where that sort of possibility of accessibility has become more difficult. In the case of party politics, you might say, well, there, assessing parties isn't that hard. We still kind of, for the most part, well, maybe, but for the most part, I say. I mean, sometimes people come out of nowhere and run for office and they're hard to assess as well, of course. But for the most part, we still sort of know what's what. But there, the challenge might be more accessibility. And this might sound surprising, given that our era is to some degree characterized precisely, you might say, by very interesting experiments in actually making parties more accessible. So think, for instance, of the various experiments in Southern Europe. Think of 5 Stars in Italy, think of Podemos, think of Momentum in the UK, the mass support, the mass membership drive that essentially helped Jeremy Corbyn into office and has kept him there ever since, even in the face of more or less complete opposition from his own members of parliament. Yes, on one level that looks like it's about giving people a new kind of access and maybe even a qualitatively higher kind of access. The bad news is that those of our colleagues who try to study these new parties, sometimes now called digital parties, because for them the internet is obviously so important in how they run their various exercise in participation and accessibility, that a lot of these experiments, when you look more closely, are not as promising as perhaps some people have hoped. That what looks like participation via the web, for instance with the 5 Star Movement, which even calls its system, as some of you may remember, Rousseau, just in case you didn't get it in terms of why this is so particularly democratic and great, that if you look more closely, the results often pretty much resemble mass plebiscites online. And they produce results in terms of the leadership got X percentage that would have made Stalin pretty happy. So it doesn't look at this point as if we had sort of valid models of more access or more participation that we could somehow draw on. If anything, as one of our colleagues has put it, what we see is something that he has categorized as participationism, where it looks like people get to participate more, they kind of go through the exercises, it kind of makes a good impression on the outside, but it's not truly substantial participation in a way that we might have come to expect it, at least in some more traditional parties in the 20th century. I'll finish on that not exactly very hopeful and optimistic note. You said at the beginning that I was going to suggest, innovative proposals and so on. The Bible didn't always do that either, so I hope it's okay if I refrain from that as well. I actually do have a couple of things I could talk about if anybody's interested, but I'll leave it at that for now because we're already 5 minutes over, and I look forward to a discussion about any of what I said or anything else that anybody else might possibly be interested in.